So welcome back to Panorama of the Bible online. We finally have moved into the New Testament. So here we move from all of the story of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, into the New Testament narrative. And the reason you're taking Panorama, the reason you're doing this is the New Testament and all of the things that are going on in the New Testament, what Jesus is doing, the actions he's taking, the things that he's saying, the things that Paul and the New Testament writers will then say about Jesus, it is all anchored in a long story that is started way back in Genesis 1 and 2 in the garden and extending through to the time of Jesus. Jesus is defining what he is doing in terms of this ancient narrative. And unless we understand the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, what's going on in the story beforehand, then Jesus really doesn't make that much sense. And what's happened is, because the Old Testament is confusing and it's intimidating and we don't like reading it as American, Gentile, non-Jewish people, then we've lost a lot of the context of what Jesus is doing. And this session, hopefully now, will give new color, new clarity, new insight for you into the things that Jesus is all about. And when we see it, man, it's amazing. And it shines, and it's beautiful what Jesus is doing. And so that's why you're taking Panorama. With that in mind, we've been working through a couple primary illustrations that we've tried to make sense of the Old Testament narrative. The first one, by now, I'm sure you're getting sick of seeing. It is this one. This is the illustration we've been working with more than any other. The picture of God inviting. So if you remember, God has invited humanity into sacred space, onto the cosmic mountain, the garden called Eden, and saying, I'm going to bring you into blessing to be where I dwell, and then you will take that blessing out to the rest of the world. And what we've noted is that power, that force called sin that enslaves humanity, and we see all of the issues that we have, from the brokenness and selfishness and greed and lust, all of that idolatry is now, instead of blessing going out, it's a dark power called sin that is now going out into the human condition. And it's behind the story of all the issues that we see in humanity in our world. And what the story of the Bible is asking is essentially this, that unless we place Jesus back in the story, then we will lose some of the meaning of Jesus. Here's the question of the Bible. How will God respond? The mess that humans have made, instead of blessing going out, now it is this curse of sin going out. How will God respond? Will he leave us to the mess and say, you made your mess, now lie in it? Or will God enter into the mess himself? And what we see in the Old Testament narrative is God invites a family to be his representatives to take that blessing. It's the family of Abraham. And he calls Abraham into sacred space. But instead of bringing blessing, we see that Abraham's family, called Israel, will fall victim to the very same force and power of sin. It's as if the Old Testament scripture is saying the power of sin is so strong and its enslaving force is so pervasive, so everywhere, that no human has found the ability to escape the clutches of this thing called sin, called the flesh. And we're looking for one who can defeat the power of sin and therefore get back on track God's program of bringing blessing to the nations. And if we look at the second drawing that we've been working through, it's this one. The Old Testament has been building towards this answer. We're looking for one who will come, and we've been saying all along, a third person masculine singular, a he. There is one who is coming. We see the promise to Adam, that promise that one day a snake crusher will come and defeat this one who has rebelled and brought sin and brokenness into the human condition. God made a promise to Abraham that he will bless the nations through his seed, his line. God said the scepter will not depart from Judah until he to whom it belongs comes. And then God told David in 2 Samuel 7 that there will be a throne on your kingdom forever. We might say that as we looked at Daniel chapter 7, we saw that one day there will be one like a son of man who will ascend to the throne of God and receive a kingdom. And we noted that the Old Testament expectation For this third person masculine singular who was coming was the anointed one, or in Hebrew, the Mashiach. We would call that the Messiah. The Greek way, by the way, to say Mashiach is Christos, or Christ. We're looking for this one who will come. And this story is millennia in the making. It's the story of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the story of the Panorama timeline. We're looking for the He who will come and reverse the curse of sin and restore blessing to the nations. One more drawing for us to make sense of, and this is going to go back to our map. So if you think about our map, here's our map. Down here we have the Red Sea, and then Egypt. This is Egypt. And then this is the Mediterranean Sea. And if you think about where we're at on our map, there's been a consistent, this is Dead Sea, running up here to the Sea of Galilee. Here's Jerusalem. This is Israel. So if you think about it, we've had a consistent story all the way back to the very beginning. Adam and Eve are invited to Eden. They're invited to enjoy God's blessing. And when sin enters into the equation, they are banished to the east. When the people of Israel find themselves walking in rebellion and sin. So think of Jacob as he's the deceiver, this man of self-reliance. When he's fleeing from Esau, where does he flee? To the east. When we see the nation of Israel finding themselves stuck in slavery and exile, where do they head? To Babylon in the east. Where does Babylon sit? It's in the east. There is a narrative in Scripture of this eastward movement for the people of God in exile or in rebellion. It's constant. It's all over the Scripture. And even though we looked last week at the return from exile, even though some of the Israelites have returned to their homeland, what we're going to see, this is, by the way, the story of Daniel chapter 2 and 7, the people of Israel find themselves back in their homeland, and yet they're still under foreign power. It's like they're home, but not home. They're in the land, but they're still in exile. The exile is not yet over. And if you remember the promise that God made through the archangel Gabriel to Daniel, the exile will be longer than you think. You thought it was a 70-year exile over here in Babylon. You thought it was 70 years. But no, it's actually 70 times 7 years that you will find yourself in exile. But one day, even though you're back in the land, one day Yahweh will come personally. And the Old Testament expectation is that one day Yahweh, God Himself, will come. And when He comes, He will defeat the enemies of Israel. He will forgive their sin. He will end their exile, and He will bring about restoration of the kingdom. That's what we're waiting for as we turn the pages to our New Testament. And that serves for us as a background. We've been saying it all along. We can't understand Jesus unless we understand what's going on in the Hebrew Scriptures. And as we turn now to look at session 10, I know this is a longer introduction, but that's our background to how we got here in the story. And now let's take a look at session 10, the life of Christ.